Welcome to the Oxford Clay Pottery podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I founded an eco-conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. Now, I don't just make pottery, I make resources such as books and courses for other potters who want to be more eco-conscious in their pottery practice. And that's what this podcast is all about. It's about me sharing everything I've learned with you, and I can't wait to get started. Let's go. Hello, so before we get on with the episode, I wanted to tell you about two completely free guides that I've made just for you about pottery. And the first guide is called How to Make a Pottery Glaze. So if you've ever been curious about how to make your own pottery glaze, this guide will show you exactly how to make your own glaze from start to finish. It tells you all the ingredients you need. It tells you step by step how to make the glaze, how to stay safe when glaze making, and it's got a stoneware glaze recipe in there. And if you've been curious about how to fire pottery, I have also made a guide on electric kiln firing. So this guide will tell you all the different terms that's used in like kiln firing, and what they mean, and it also takes you through the exact firing schedule that I use to do my bisque firing and also stoneware glaze firing. So it's got all the temperatures in there, all the timings in there, and both of these guides are available from the Oxford Clay website at www.oxfordclay.co.uk/resources for potters. Okay, let's get on with the episode. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson and it's really nice to be here with you today. And in today's episode, I want to talk to you about making your own casting slip and basically all the things I've learned along the way in my sort of 4 years practicing making casting slip. Basically this is born out of all the things that have gone wrong when I've been trying to learn how to make my own casting slip, and just some kind of top tips I've learned along the way as well. So I did have an idea that it was going to be like 6 tips for making your own casting slip. I thought that would be a great title, really snappy, and then when I started to write down all the tips, I realized there was about 13 tips. So I'm going to just go through them all basically and give you all the tips that I can think of in terms of making your own casting slip. Why on earth would you make your own slip? You can buy it from the shop, you know. Why are we doing this? Why would we do this? Okay, so the reason that potters would want to make their own casting slip is that it's a bit cheaper. You're not having to transport like all that water, you know, in your slip, in terms of like when you order the slip from the pottery supplier. If you make your own, all you need is the dry powders and you're adding your own water, and it's kind of, I guess, better for the environment because of haulage. You know, you're not having to haulage all that water in the slip. It's cheaper, the raw ingredients are cheaper. And my very top tip, the reason why I make my own slip as well, is because I can control exactly what goes into it. So I have like sort of locally sourced clays from southwest England. I only put those in my casting slip, and it means I can really, really control exactly what's going into my slip. I know exactly where they're from. I know where they're sourced in the world. I know that those ingredients are from areas where there's high regulation for environmental protection and for the protection for the workers that are mining those materials. And I know exactly what's going into it. So that's the reason that I make my own slip. It's like I know exactly what's going in it. So I actually never made casting slip when I went to evening classes. It's something I've learned to do in my own pottery practice from books. I read sort of books on how to do it, and I also watched quite a lot of YouTube videos in terms of like, you know, watching different people, how they actually made casting slip. There was a really cool one I watched actually where they added the deflocculant to the casting slip, which is the thing that actually makes it runny. It's like this chemical, and it was just incredible watching it. It was such an incredible process, just seeing the clay go from a kind of sticky clay into like this kind of beautiful flowing liquid. It was amazing. So I highly recommend those kind of videos. It's like the magic of deflocculants. So basically what I'm trying to tell you is that a lot of the things I learned were from kind of putting into practice the sort of like the things I'd learned from books and videos. I only really was able to kind of make the slip by kind of practicing and getting things wrong. And so a lot of these tips are born out of those kind of mistakes, really. But I got there in the end, and I've got a really fantastic recipe now that I use for all my pottery. So it doesn't really crack, it doesn't really warp, it's great. And it's made with like eco-conscious ingredients. So if you're interested actually in making your own casting slip, if you think it's something you want to try, you know, after listening to this episode, or you've been trying to make it and you're just like, it's not working. It did take me a really long time to perfect the kind of technique and tools and recipe. So it's my own recipe actually, which I sort of adapted from, you know, different recipes I'd read about. So if you're really interested in like learning a recipe, there's one in Eco-Friendly Pottery, 30 Simple Ways to Make Your Pottery Practice More Ethical and Sustainable. That book there, which you can get actually from Amazon, or you can get it from the Oxford Clay website. There's an ebook version on the Oxford Clay website. Yeah, so it's got the recipe in there, which is great. I'm just trying to find the page. I can't find the page. Stop looking for the page. You're in the middle of a podcast episode. Okay, so right, let's get on to the tips. Okay, so tip number one, when you're working with any kinds of powders in pottery, any kind of clays, powdered material, powdered rocks, you really need to be wearing an FFP3 face mask. Okay, so this will protect your lungs from silica dust. You don't want to breathe in silica dust. Okay, so that's my number one top tip. You need a face mask which has got like adequate protection. So an FFP3 face mask will provide a kind of seal around your nose and mouth, you know, and it will filter out those very fine powders from the powdered rocks and clays that you're going to be using to make your casting slip. Okay, so that's tip number one. You have to use a face mask. Okay, so tip number two is that when I'm measuring out my powders, I actually use a plastic scoop, which I bought from the hardware store. I think it might actually be for like a garden type implement. I'm not sure. It's like it's like a black plastic scoop, and it is so good for just scooping out powders, you know, weighing them out. I weigh them out with the kitchen scales. So I would really recommend a plastic scoop, because it was like £1 and they're really designed for like scooping out, you know, I guess they're for scooping maybe like seeds, like grass seeds, or I don't know what. It was in the kind of gardening section of this hardware store. So yeah, I would really recommend getting a nice scoop for yourself so you can just scoop out those powders really easily. Yeah, so that's my second top tip. The third top tip is that I actually keep my powdered rocks, powdered clays. I use ball clay, I use feldspar, china clay, yeah, so I use different ball clays. I use quartz as well in my recipe. So I keep all of those powders in metal dustbins, and I keep the dustbins on top of these kind of little wheelie platform things. Really cool. It means I can just move those bins around, move them out of the way of each other, and I can just scoop the powders out. It's very easy. So it's like a really nice way of storing all the powders. It's a safe way of storing because they've got lids on. You know, those powders aren't going to be like, I don't know, getting knocked, going into the atmosphere, breathing them in. They're all contained safely in the bin. So that's my third top tip. Okay, so my fourth top tip is to use recycled rainwater in your slip. So I actually collect rainwater from the roof, and then I use that water to make my slip with. So in the book, I think it's called Slip Casting and Mold Making by Andrew Martin. It's basically like one of the definitive guides on slip casting and mold making in pottery. It's such a good book because it just goes through how to make molds. It goes through like how, different slip recipes, how to actually cast with stuff. It's so good. Andrew Martin talks about using water from ponds, I think, as like some of the best water to use in slip. So I thought, okay, I could maybe use rainwater and it's, a similar effect. I don't know if it's a similar effect because I've not used pond water, I haven't compared the two, but I just know that, there's loads of rainwater. It's abundant in the UK. It does seem to rain quite a lot sometimes. So I use that water and I use that in my slip. So that's my fourth top tip. Okay, so tip number 5 is to use paper in your casting slip. So if this is the first time you've ever heard this concept, this is probably seems quite strange, but by adding paper to clay, you make this like incredible superpowered substance that is very, very strong. And then the paper burns out in the kiln and then you're left with this like, incredible pot. But what the paper does is it can prevent cracking, particularly in casting slip cast items. And hand-built items as well. You can also throw with paper clay on the wheel, and it just adds this real strength to the thing you're making. So you actually don't need that much paper to add to casting slip to really boost the strength of it. So I read this top tip once in a book, and since then I thought, okay, well, I'm going to try and make some casting slip with a bit of paper in, and it really, really worked. It's really good, and now I do it all the time. That's my recipe. It's got I actually use bamboo kitchen roll. So kitchen roll made with bamboo fibers, but you can use any paper. You can actually even recycle paper into clay. So if you're interested in paper clay, actually, there's a really good book on paper clay by Rosette Galt, and that just goes through different artists who use paper clay in their work. It goes through all the different ratios of like paper to clay and all the different uses. You can use it for in pottery, and say like clay with more paper in, use for this, and clay with less paper in, use for this. And it's really, really good book. So that's where I learned the concept of adding paper to clay. So I'd really, really highly recommend adding paper to casting slip. So the downside of adding paper is that it can make the slip flow a bit less well when you're actually casting, but the upside is that it's really, really makes your slip cast wear incredibly strong. So it's fantastic. So okay, so that's tip number 5. I've actually numbered all my tips because I've numbered them all, and then I just hopefully won't get mixed up with the mega 13 tips. Okay, so tip number 6 is to use a recipe with ball clay in. Okay, so you can use different casting slip recipes if you're making your own casting slip, but just to say, ones with ball clay in generally make a very strong casting slip. So ball clay really adds strength to your pot, and so what I found is it's a great way of making pottery that's stronger, more robust. When you're kind of working with it after you've slip cast something, you might be adding decoration. You might even want to raw glaze it. Where you dip it in glaze before you fire it, for its first firing. But by using a recipe which is high in ball clay, it will again help to stop cracking. It just makes that pot like really, really strong. So I'd really recommend that. Okay, so that's number 6, and then number 7 is to weigh out your sodium silicate straight onto your kitchen roll or your paper that you're using in your casting slip. Okay, so let me just explain more about this. Okay, so when you make a casting slip, you have to add a substance called a deflocculant, and deflocculants are the thing that turn the clay from a kind of sticky clay into this beautiful flowing clay, and you have to have some some kind of deflocculant to make a casting slip, really. You can't really make a slip otherwise. So what I use is sodium silicate, and it comes in this kind of clear, I use sodium silicate 140s. I think that's just the measure of strength of the sodium silicate, and it's quite a sort of viscous, almost like a kind of gel-like substance. It's kind of like a very, if you'd imagine like a very, very thick kind of corn syrup or sugar syrup, it's a bit like that. And it kind of it's actually quite tricky to measure out. So what I started doing was, I was like, basically, first of all, I was like measuring it out with a spoon. I get it all over the spoon, and then the thing with the deflocculant is you have to be very, very precise, because it's very easy to add too much. So I'd have this spoon, and I was like, I had the deflocculant on, and I was like, I don't know how much is on the spoon, left on the spoon, because it's such a viscous liquid. There'd be some left on the spoon, there'd be some in the casting slip. I'd be like, oh no, I don't know how to measure this out. So what I started doing was I started measuring, just literally pouring it out. It's such a viscous liquid that you can just pour it out onto a piece of kitchen roll. And I needed 9 grams for my sort of 5 litres worth of casting slip. And so I just would pour it straight onto like a piece of kitchen roll that I was then going to incorporate into that slip anyway. So, it's the paper clay part of it. I would just take 1 sheet of the paper that I was going to put into the casting slip, and I would put the sodium silicate, just pour it out. I still do this, pour it out onto the piece of kitchen roll, and then I can just incorporate that piece of kitchen roll into the casting slip. So it's like you're not having to wash anything, you're not having to wash a spoon, you're not having to guess how much sodium silicate is left on the spoon. It's great. So that's probably like, it says like sort of slip making hacks. That's like up there. So, okay, so that's tip number 7. And tip number 8 is so you've got your paper, you're going to put it into your casting slip when you're making it. So what I do is I get the paper, I break it up first, and I add it to the water part of the casting slip. So in this sort of, I use like a measuring jug, and I've got like the water part of it. I've got the sodium silicate part, because that came in with like one of the sheets of kitchen rolls on top of that, and then I've got all the other sheets of kitchen roll. And then what I do is I actually use a hand blender, just like a stick blender like you use in the kitchen for like blending a soup or something. I'd recommend having a separate one for pottery. Don't like then blend your soup with it, with all the pottery on it and stuff. But what I do is I basically use a stick blender to zhuzh, like blend up the paper into a kind of paper pulp water sodium silicate suspension. So that is my kind of liquid that I'm going to then be adding to the dry ingredients that I've weighed out. So that's what I found, is that is the absolute best way to add the sodium silicate, the water and the paper, to make that kind of solution of those 3 things. That's the best way of adding those 3 things in a way that then is properly kind of incorporated into the casting slip. So that's, the hand blender is such a good thing to use, because it's actually really good for mixing up glazes as well. But it just, if you're trying to use paper, you want that paper to be in a real kind of pulp, you want the fibers to be all kind of free of being in that sheet of paper, because you want to then have it all really evenly distributed in your casting slip, so that's a really good way of doing it. Mix really well, mixes it before you then add it to your slip. Okay, so that's tip number 8. Okay, tip number 9 is something that I've tried. I say this is something I do now because I've had loads of kind of trial and error in the past. So what I do now, this is tip number 9, is to make up small amounts of slip each time. Okay, so actually I now use, I actually make up a slip amount every time of about 5 litres. So I have it in a 10 litre bucket, so it's kind of like just it's kind of lots of room in there for like mixing it, but I don't want to make up too much slip in one go. The reason for this is because it's really easy to get the deflocculation amount wrong, and sometimes you accidentally add a teeny weeny bit too much, or you haven't quite added enough and it's not properly deflocculated and you add a little bit more, and you just don't want too much slip to be you don't want too much of that slip. You don't want to be messing with it too much, like too much of amount of it. If it goes wrong, that's like a lot a lot of your clay, you know, that has gone into that slip. Because basically if you over deflocculate a slip, you add too much sodium silicate or something to it, it actually then becomes impossible to pour. So it basically it goes the other way, where it becomes like really viscous again. So it's a very weird experience. It's like it's actually very difficult to tell sometimes as well if you've over deflocculated it or if it actually needs more deflocculant. But by making up small batches, it means that like you're wasting less if that process does go wrong. So that's what I do now. I just do like 5 litres basically of slip. I just make up 5 batches of 5 litres at a time, and then I use that up, and then I make another batch. So I just found that to be so much less stressful than having like this huge vat of slip that you're trying to deflocculate, and it's a bit stressful. So so we're kind of getting on to the actual kind of mixing, you know, actually making the slip now. So number 10 is to actually mix your slip with a paddle mixer. Okay, so paddle mixers are really cool. They're like this tool basically that's used in the kind of construction industry, building industry, where like things need to be mixed, like cement, like very, very heavy duty substances need to be mixed. So it's things like, you know, cement, plaster they're mixed with paddle mixers. And what's so good about them is that they are made for very heavy duty activities. And what's also really good about them is that they're quite affordable as well. So they are, because I guess there's a lot of people working in the construction industry or needing paddle mixers, you know, economies of scale are a more affordable way of mixing your slip than say buying maybe like a specialist pottery slip mixer. You can literally just hold the paddle mixer like over your bucket of slip and just mix all the ingredients together. So essentially it's like a kind of drill type situation where you're holding it with 2 hands, and it's got like this kind of rotating middle part, and then attached to that is a kind of mixing part. So for my one, I can't detach the mixing part. It's just literally like a massive kind of blender that you hold, and it's like the stick basically is a kind of mixing part that then kind of just mixes all the ingredients together. And like I said, it can really handle mixing like really heavy duty things. And do you know, I have to say, before I got a paddle mixer, I was actually mixing slip by hand, and it was taking me so long. And then when I got my paddle mixer, I literally mixed the slip in about 5 minutes, and you know, it was literally taking me probably 45 minutes to mix that slip otherwise, you know, to make sure it was all, you know, by hand. So and a lot of hard work. So I would really, really recommend, if you're going to be like making, you know, slip often, it's a really good way of like, you know, cutting down your labor, making sure the slip is mixed really well. There's specialist equipment out there for you. It's available for you. And like I said, it's like, you know, it's pretty affordable as well. So yeah, paddle mixer, absolute top tip. So that's number 10. So number 11 is to use a silicone spatula to help you to mix your slip. Okay, so I actually use a silicone spatula when I'm actually making slip. I use it to try to, you know, a bit like, you know, so silicone spatula, I just mean like the one you'd get at the supermarket, like, or something for baking. So it's like a piece of baking equipment. You basically, you know, it's really good at getting like, you know, cake mixes out of bowls. They're so fantastic. You can use the same thing for making sure you've got all the powder from the outside of the bucket when you're mixing. That's what I use it for. And then I also use a silicone spatula when I'm actually going to come to use the slip. I mix it up with a silicone spatula, you know, and then I pour it after that. Okay, so they are so good. So I would really recommend using one of those for helping you to mix slip, and then just helping you to move slip around basically. And then tip number 12 is that, so, okay, I didn't actually used to do this. I'd read in a book that it was a really good idea to sieve slip before you use it. I read that it was good because it sort of would get lumps in, or it would, you know, like bits would dry or something in between each time you used it. And they were saying basically like sieve it every time, you'll get like beautiful pots, you know, you need to make sure there's no lumps in it. And I just thought, that sounds like a real palaver. I really don't want to wash the sieve every time. I was like, I can't be bothered. And so then I started to find that some of the stuff I cast actually was uneven, or it had like little lumps in, and you know, I was having to sponge them down afterwards. I thought, oh dear, this is because I haven't sieved it. So, you know, I thought, I don't want to wash that sieve, but what I'm telling you is that it's definitely worth it. And so what I do now is I actually sieve the slip every time I make stuff, because like that book said, you do get like weird lumps in slip. You know, it's maybe just dried on the wall of the bucket or something and fallen in the slip. And so by sieving it every time, you're ensuring that you've got a really beautiful pouring slip that then will pour evenly. It will make evenly walled pots, which is really what you want to prevent warping. You know, it creates this beautiful, smooth sort of, it's almost like melted chocolate. It's incredible, like the kind of texture you get from the casting slip when you sieved it. It's just lovely. So definitely sieve your casting slip before you make anything with it. And yeah, I know washing the sieve is a pain. I'm sorry, but it's definitely worth it. So I actually also use my silicone spatula to push the slip through the sieve as well. So that's another really good use of a silicone spatula. Okay, and then we're on to our final tip. Our final tip of the day in terms of making your own casting slip is, if you make slip and it's like too viscous, it seems like it won't pour very well. Yes, you can add more deflocculant, but I would really super recommend adding more water first. Okay, so this is my top tip. Quite often, it just needs a little bit more water. It doesn't need more deflocculant. If you, like I said to you earlier in the episode, if you add too much deflocculant, you can over deflocculate the slip and then it just won't pour at all. And there's kind of like not really much you can do, and you've kind of broken your slip, so to speak. So if you've made it and you're like, it's not pouring well, it's too viscous, just try adding some water, and just try adding little bits of water at a time, mixing it up with that paddle mixer again, or you know, even by hand you can mix it. I mean, you could try adding like 1 more gram of sodium silicate. You could try that. It's literally minuscule how much deflocculant you need. So it's very easy to over deflocculate slips. So that's my final top tip. Just add a bit of water, see how it is from that, and then add your deflocculant like after if it's still not working. Yeah. Just checking the mic's on. I was like, oh no, was the mic on? It's actually, I think it's on, so that's good. Okay, so let's just run through those top tips again. Those 13 tips for making your own casting slip. The first one is always wear an FFP3 face mask. Number 2, when you're making slip, absolutely. Number 2 is keep your powders in bins with lids on, and maybe, you know, on a little wheelie trolley that you can wheel around. Tip number 3 is use a plastic scoop from the garden centre or, you know, other hardware store to scoop out your powders. Tip number 4 is to use rainwater. I've just got this notion that I've mixed up 2 and 3. I'm very sorry if that's the case. Okay, tip number 4 is to use rainwater in your casting slip. That's a great way of like recycling water into your work, conserving tap water. Tip number 5 is to use paper in your work. So I use bamboo kitchen roll. It's amazing, makes your slip cast wear really strong. It's great. Tip number 6 is to use a recipe with ball clay in. Again, it will add so much strength to your slipwear. Tip number 7 is to weigh out your deflocculant, so maybe sodium silicate if you're using that, onto a piece of paper, the paper that you're going to be then incorporating into your casting slip. And this is a great way of not having to wash any spoons, to really accurately measure out your deflocculant, which is what you want with a deflocculant. Okay, tip number 8, where are we? Tip number 8, this is very confusing because I've scribbled them out, written the numbers. Tip number 8 is to use a hand blender, like one of those stick blenders you'd maybe you know, use for like soups or something in the kitchen. Blend your paper and water and sodium silicate deflocculant together first using a hand blender. That'll give you like a really nice kind of, paper pulp to then add to your casting slip. Tip number 9 is to make fairly small batches of slip at a time, and that's just to try and help you get the deflocculation right. Try not to, waste too much clay basically if it goes wrong, which, can happen. So yeah, I'd say 5 litre, I make 5 litres at a time, and that's like the perfect amount for me. So tip number 10. Don't want to go backwards. Too many tips. This is the problem. Tip number 10 is to mix your slip with a paddle mixer. Don't do it by hand like I did. It takes you a really long time. Let things be easy. Let yourself do it with a paddle mixer. Just let yourself just stand there and have the paddle mixer mix your slip for you. It's amazing. Tip number 11 is to use a silicone spatula when mixing. Really helps you to incorporate all the powders, mix your slip really well. It's, they were invented to help bakers. Let's use these amazing products that bakers have and get a silicone spatula for mixing slip. Tip number 12 is to sieve your slip before you use it. Might seem like a massive palaver, but it makes so much better pots, honestly, and it's definitely worth it. So you don't get like lumps or uneven pots, it's so good. Tip number 13, the final tip is to don't add any more deflocculant. If you've made your slip, it's not quite flowing properly at the end, my top tip is to add a bit of water first, and then you can start messing around with the deflocculant. But yeah, just like I was saying to you, too much deflocculant is very easy to do. So just add a bit of water first, give it a mix, see how it is, and then take it from there in terms of adding deflocculant afterwards. So wow, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. I hope these tips have been helpful for you. If you're making your own slip, or you're thinking about making your own slip, I would really urge you to do it. It's a really good way of making pottery. It's really fun. It's just even making the slip is fun, and all the kind of the drama about deflocculation. It's will it deflocculate properly? What's going to happen? And just that magic that adding a deflocculant does to when you're mixing clay. It's just incredible. And casting is so cool. It enables you to make the same kind of dish over and over again, or pot over and over again. It's a really good resource for potters. So I've loved talking to you about it, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you on the next episode. And until then, happy potting until then, and I'll see you soon. Okay, bye bye. Thank you so much for joining me for the Oxford Clay Pottery podcast. If you're interested in learning more about Oxford Clay or eco-conscious pottery, there's so much for you on the Oxford Clay website. There's books, e-courses, there's a blog on there, loads of other podcast episodes, and I can't wait to share it with you. The web address is oxfordclay.co.uk. I'll see you over there.